Yay, we're live. All right, let's just give a moment for everyone to get notified and jump in here. Hello, we're just waiting for people to arrive. Good fun. Okay, we've got some people rocking up. Oh, hi, Kate. Say hi, guys. Let me know where you're from. We'll just give it a couple of minutes to let everyone get notified and jump on in. Let's hope I don't sound like a frog while I do this. Hi, Tara. Tara. It's always fun when people write their names and you're like, how do I pronounce that? Is everyone else staying warm? The really nice thing I like about where I am now is that this wall behind me is on the lounge room wall and the fireplace is literally right there. So even when I'm up at the crack of dawn, it's beautiful. Oh, Western Sydney. Very nice. It's a bit later in the evening over there. Well, thank you for joining us. Is it as cold in Sydney as it is here? It's actually not that cold, but for me. All right, we'll wait for a few more people and then we will get started. Give them a little happy dance. Make sure my computer's good. I've got to stop jiggling around. Things are jumping. Oh, the Swan Valley. Nice, Tara. I'm in 2J. For those of you who actually know where that is, it's over the big scary hill. Days are nice, but cold at night. 3 degrees? Yeah, it's about the same here. It's going to get down to 1 and 0 over the next couple of days. So I think winter is officially here. Had to say it, didn't I? All right. Okay, shall we get going? All right, let's just get into it. All righty, folks. So for those of you who don't know me, which I don't think is many of you, but we'll go with that anyway. My name is Stacey Dadd and I am the owner and chief baker here at Champaign and Gumboots. Champaign and Gumboots is a 100% gluten-free baking business. I do many things. First and foremost, though, I am a recipe developer and I have been baking all my life, but I have been baking exclusively gluten-free for the last 7 years. And over the last few years, I have been making other delicious goodies, and I have helped an awful lot of people. And the more people I help and the more people I talk to, the more I realize that I have all of this knowledge about gluten-free baking in my head. And what's the point in it being in there? Okay? So I'm here to share my gluten-free baking secrets with you guys. And at the end of the day, I wanted a really cool format to be able to share that with all you guys, and figured why not YouTube. I always wanted a cooking channel when I was a kid. I used to sit in my year 6 class, don't tell my teacher, and pretend I was on a cooking show. So this is kind of cool. So tonight I am going to share with you guys my 3 really, really easy steps to making gluten-free pastry work for you. In particular, I'm going to focus on the frozen store-bought variety because it's temperamental stuff. And honestly, it does my head in sometimes. And it's just been through a lot of trial and error over the last umpteen years that I've figured out a few little secrets that pretty much if you implement them every time, you're always going to get amazing gluten-free pastry. which, when used with my amazing sausage roll recipe, be awesome. Hi, Kate. I hope you got your email. I just sent it to you. So, my big thing here, guys, is I want to be able to share all of my recipes, and I'm glad you know where 2J is. Hi, Peter. For those of you who actually don't know where 2J is, Gamelling is further out, just if you're wondering. All right. So I really wanted to share with you guys not only my recipes, but all my tips and tricks for making things work. And even though I've got all my recipes on my blog, sometimes things are lost in translation, or there are little things that I do automatically during baking that you might not do, that I don't always write down. So that's why I want to be able to show you guys. And that's fantastic, Julie. I'm glad you love my pastry. Unfortunately, the only recipe I have is for a short crust pastry, which is what Julie's used. So I am working on a puff pastry, just so you know. So, like I was saying, I wanted to build this YouTube channel to share all of my delicious recipes with you guys, but just share all the little bits and pieces that I've picked up along the way, and the tips and tricks that you need to know to be able to nail gluten-free baking. So, but tonight we're going to talk about pastry because it's the bane of most of our existence. You know, if you ever want to make pretty much anything, like a nice pie or a quiche, my favorite, of course, is sausage rolls. So, you know, using store-bought gluten-free pastry is difficult. You know, if you've ever done it, then you'll know all too well how temperamental some of the brands can be. Which is pretty much the description for gluten-free in general. Gluten-free generally means temperamental. But we are going to talk about 3 brands in particular, the Coles gluten-free pastry, the Simply Wize pastry, and the Genius brand pastry. Now, why those 3? Because they are the most readily available, and each of them have unique properties that I like. So, because if you actually had to ask me which one was my favorite, I couldn't tell you exactly. It would depend on what I was doing. So, sorry, I did just literally have tonsillitis last week, so I had no voice. So I'm hoping I'm going to not lose my voice again, or I can at least tomorrow, not tonight. So you've got the 3 primary brands, Coles, Simply Wize, and Genius. Now, the problem with these 3 brands is it will very much depend on your local store as to what you can get. And so that's why I want to give you all the tips and tricks that you'll be able to go into whatever pastry you use and apply them. And if you come up with a problem, you'll be able to troubleshoot it using these little tricks and fix it and keep going. Because I know out here, I can't get the Coles pastry at all. So my local IGA sells the Simply Wize brand, my local Woolies sells the Simply Wize brand, and my local Coles sells diddly bloody squat. In fact, their gluten-free section is meh. So I don't really want to drive to Perth just to get pastry, especially when it's like $8. Anyway, so it's very much dependent on what your local stores sell. Okay, some IGAs will sell the Genius brand, which is a great brand. Some will sell the Coles brand, some will sell the Simply Wize brand. It really depends on your local shops and what's available to you guys. So what is the difference? This is a big one, because understanding the difference between the pastries will help you figure out how to fix it or use it more appropriately. And this actually applies to an awful lot of gluten-free pre-packaged products that you have to use, like a bread mix, for example. If you actually have a look at the ingredients list, you can get an idea of what it's doing. So, for example, the Simply Wize gluten-free puff pastry is probably the simplest with the least amount of ingredients of any of the pastries. Now, that's good, but it has its drawbacks. Okay, it uses traditional fat, so butter, whereas the other brands don't. It also doesn't use any oil, and that's a very, very important factor, which I'll get to in a minute. The Coles brand and the Genius brand are actually very similar, and they actually use a margarine which uses vegetable oil as its primary fattening level, okay? And that makes a huge difference. The other big difference, and if you've ever handled the Simply Wize pastry and the Coles pastry, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. One of them is much nicer to roll out and work with than the other. And the reason comes down to the Coles pastry has xanthan gum and guar gum. Guar? I don't know. Guar gum. Now, the gums is what gives us the elasticity that gluten normally does, okay? So to get all sciencey on you for just 1 minute, and honestly, this is a very deep rabbit hole you could go down. The concept of what gluten does is huge. Gluten does so many different things to our baked goods. And the unfortunate thing with gluten-free baking is that there is no one singular product that we've found in existence yet that will replicate all of what gluten does. So when we convert a recipe, we have to try and replicate what gluten does in multiple aspects. Okay, so that's why we add gums to baked goods, is to give us elasticity and stretch, which is, with pastry, rather important. So understanding that the differences between and what the actual ingredients are between the pastry is going to make it a lot easier for you to work with. But enough fluffing about, because seriously, I could talk about the science of gluten-free baking until I'm blue in the face. And given that I'm highly asthmatic, that's probably not a good idea. So let's get into it, hey? Tip number 1, and this is not always the easiest tip, but fresh is best. Now, it's frozen pastry, I hear you say. Look, Stacey, seriously, can't I just buy it and put it in my freezer and use it whenever? Okay. The tip to amazing gluten-free frozen puff pastry is to use it within 24 hours of buying it, okay? I'll even buy it the day I need to use it. I know that's not convenient. I know it kind of eradicates the whole purpose of frozen store-bought pastry, but it makes a huge difference. And if you've ever used the Simply Wize pastry, then you'll understand why. Simply Wize pastry has a tendency to crack and fall apart. And if your pastry is starting to crack around the edges before it's even defrosted, I can always guarantee you it's too old. The other thing is to check your expiry dates. Always have a look at them. Now, your expiry date will probably say, oh, it's not due till, December this year. But always double check, because if a, let's say, country-based IGA or Coles store, they might not go through it very often, which means that puff pastry has actually been sitting in their freezer for months. A great little tidbit to keep in mind here is to get really friendly with your local staff, because I know the local Woolworths, to me, actually restocks their frozen gluten-free stuff on a Tuesday morning. Now, I used to do all my shopping on a Monday morning. How long's the pastry been sitting in their freezer for? So if I shop on a Tuesday morning, I'm getting stuff that they've recently unpacked. Then I take it home, whack it in my freezer until tomorrow, and use it. And I can tell you, from this one step alone, my gluten-free puff pastry problems have almost disappeared. How awesome is that? Seriously, just buy it and use it, okay? Now, tip number 2 is how to actually defrost it. Now, depending on who you talk to, it'll depend on, everyone's got different tips and tricks, but there are a couple of different things that you can do. And the first thing I want you to do is think about the temperature of the room you're in. This actually plays an important role in every type of baking where you are looking at a solid product. So, for example, melting moment biscuits, same thing. If your butter is too cold, it makes it too hard to work with. If your pastry is too cold and your room is too cold, it's not going to make it easy to work with. And I can tell you this, decorating cakes, same rule applies. I have actually decorated cake with a hairdryer in my hand, heating up the buttercream to make it stay cold while I went, to make it stay warm while I went. Nuts, huh? But the temperature of your room makes a big, big difference. So if you've got the fire going like I do right now because it's cold outside, the ambient temperature in your kitchen is going to be a lot warmer, okay? But it's also going to be a lot drier. So is it going to dry out your pastry? Short answer, yes. So if it's a hot summery day, what's going to happen? Your pastry is going to dry out much faster, especially if you've got the air conditioner on. So there are things we need to do to overcome those steps. But first and foremost, always look at the temperature in your room. So what's a couple of easy ways to defrost your pastry? First and foremost, I pull it out of the packet, I separate it, whack it on the bench out of direct sunlight, and I cover it in a clean towel. Okay? That's my go-to if I think the temperature's right and everything's going to behave itself. You can tell pretty quickly by the way the pastry is starting to defrost or potentially even fall apart, whether or not it's going to be a pain in the butt. Okay? So if it is starting to fall apart, or if your room is too dry, okay, and too hot, then a really great way to deal with it is wrap it in cling wrap, just very loosely while it's in a frozen state, or even pop it in a plastic bag, which, well, many of us don't actually have any of those laying around the house anymore. So what this will do is actually help the condensation and the moisture stay locked into the pastry as it defrosts. And you do need to give it quite some time. In comparison, like your old Pampers pastry used to defrost really quickly, like 15 minutes. Gluten-free pastry can take up to 40, 45 minutes. So always try and keep that in mind, because if you try to roll it out too soon, it'll just fall apart and crack into a horrible mess, and you will have wasted the better part of $10. That ain't nice. Being gluten-free is expensive enough as it is. So if you start to roll out your pastry and it starts to fall apart, what can you do to fix it and rescue it? The biggest thing and the easiest thing you can do is use your hands. If you've got holes in your pastry, you can do the same thing. And I normally just literally put my hands flat down over the pastry and let the warmth sort of seep through and start to relax the pastry. And eventually, after, I'm not going to lie, quite some time, it will become a soft, malleable product. Okay? The last tip I have, and this is one that I actually haven't tried that much, but I have done it once and it worked really, really well. So I'm going to experiment a little bit more with it. But I have had a number of people tell me it's their go-to way to defrost their pastry. And it's pop it in the fridge overnight, covered, and use it the next day. Most fridges have quite a humid environment, so it's not going to dry out, especially if it stays covered. So I'm going to play more with that one, and I'm going to let you guys know in the comments down the track what the goal is and whether this is a really easy way to do it. And take through the water. Throat's starting to hurt. Poor throat. All right, and we'll keep going. Now, my number 3, and this is one most people realise because the packets actually tell you to do this on the instructions, and it's to roll it out. It is surprising, though, how many people I talk to don't realise that gluten-free puff pastry is not designed to be used how it comes. It's almost a centimetre or more thick. It's actually really, really chunky. And if you try to make a sausage roll out of that, it's not going to work. Nah, not at all. So I want you to roll it out. But I know I can hear you already saying, Stacey, no, it doesn't work. It does. You just need a couple of tricks, okay? The first and foremost, I like it, Julie. Oh my God. The first and foremost I want you to do is try the baking paper trick. Alrighty, this is my go-to for pastry, whether I make it myself or buy it. Take 2 pieces of parchment paper or baking paper, depending on what country you're in, and you're going to put one piece under your pastry and one piece on top of your pastry, and then you're going to roll it out with your rolling pin. It doesn't stick to your rolling pin. It doesn't stick to your bench, and then to transfer it onto a tray or into a pie tin, all you do is take the top piece off and inverted. Pretty simple, huh? But if you're not a fan of the baking paper trick, you can use flour to dust your rolling pin and your bench. But, and this is where reading your ingredients list comes into play, never add a type of flour to your pastry that isn't already in it. In fact, never add an ingredient to your pastry, period, that isn't already in it. So what do I mean by that? All right, so I'm dying over here, seriously. The primary flour ingredients in all gluten-free products will be listed. So it'll say gluten-free flour, and then in brackets, it'll tell you what they are. Now, a really common one you'll see is rice, tapioca, or cornstarch, okay? The primary ingredient in the Coles gluten-free pastry is rice flour. Do not use a plain or self-raising flour blend that you've got sitting in the pantry. It's not ideal, particularly if on the very, very rare occasion your pastry ends up sticky and you actually have to add more of this flour in. You're going to completely unbalance the product, okay? And that's not going to be ideal, and good chances are your pastry will fall apart, okay? Now, if your pastry is still a little bit cracky and falling apart at this point, you might need a tiny bit of moisture. Now, again, knowing what your ingredients are is vital. So the Coles brand of pastry and the Genius brand both use vegetable oil. The Simply Wize brand doesn't use any oil and uses water. Why is that important? If you added oil into the Simply Wize brand, it wouldn't work at all. It'll probably destroy your pastry. In fact, I've tried it and it does. So don't do that. So if your Simply Wize pastry needs a little bit more moisture, just add, and I mean like half a teaspoon of water. But if your Coles or your Genius brand pastry is a little bit dry, you add a little bit of vegetable oil, okay? Now, I'm not a huge fan of adding stuff to pastries if you can avoid it. If you absolutely have to, that's the way to do it, okay? Now, there are two other tips that I have inside of this third tip that makes dealing with your pastry much, much easier. And this comes down to cooking it. Because at the end of the day, if you've ever baked gluten-free pastry in any way, shape, or form, particularly if you're using a trusty pie maker, because we all know how wonderful those things are, or if you're making sausage rolls or blind baking it in the oven, always egg wash it. You can't not egg wash a gluten-free pastry. It becomes really pale, it stays white, and it doesn't brown up, but I also find it doesn't flake beautifully, okay? So the key, this is a little extra tip, the key is to only ever egg wash the top, okay? So all we're doing is just beating an egg. We all know how to beat an egg. Use a little pastry brush it over top. Always beat the top of the pastry. Never, ever face the sides, because it will weigh down your puff pastry and stop it from lifting. And we need the lift in the puff pastry to give us that beautiful flaky texture, okay? So always egg wash it, and always, always make sure your oven is extra hot. If you put my sausage roll recipe, for example, in the oven at 180 degrees, it's going to turn into a soggy mess and it won't flake beautifully. For you to get amazing flaky gluten-free puff pastry, your temperature needs to be high, okay? So brackets are 200, my sausage rolls are 200, 220 Celsius, obviously, for the odd person in here that's not from Australia. I know I've got a few non-Australian followers, so it gets a little confusing, but there you go, okay? Now, I have a fourth bonus tip for you, and it's not really a tip, it's more what not to do. The key is definitely not to add too much oil or too much water, okay? If your pastry is being an absolute pain in the butt and it's not rolling out and it's not working for you, you're going to have to dedicate a good 10 minutes to getting it warm and making it like Play-Doh. So if you take all of your puff pastry in its chunky bits, because we all know how it breaks apart, and squish it all together and then squish it into your hands and like walk around the house with it. Use the heat from your hands to make it really, really soft. And this is not a small process. It takes a while. Work it and start kneading it almost. I've got a sore hand. Kneading it until your pastry comes together, and eventually it will resemble a really beautiful, soft, slightly easier to work with pastry. Then you can go back to step number 3 and roll it out between your sheets of baking paper and end up with a beautiful product. Can you use a hairdresser to warm it up? No, I probably wouldn't use a hairdresser, Julie. But you could use a hairdryer. I would avoid it because you're blasting it with hot, dry heat. And so it'll actually be the heat would warm it up, but the air would dry it out much faster. So I would really avoid that if you could. Okay. I have, and this is not probably a technical ability, I have stood over the fireplace with a piece of pastry in my hands, or I have even stood, you know, the little crack above your oven door that pushes out fan heat. When the oven's been pumping for a while, that's quite hot. I've actually been impatient and dangled a piece of puff pastry up and down in front of that, getting it to, that's also not ideal because it's dry heat, but I find the warmth from that makes a big difference. But I have sat in front of the fireplace many, many occasions warming up my pastry. I think that was my last tip, and now I've gotten slightly distracted. While I'm double checking I've covered everything, do you have any questions? Pop it in the comments and let me know. Oops, I'm bumping things around. Now, if you have ever used any of the pastries, then you will know that they are all different. Like I said, the ingredients are vastly different. One of them uses corn flour, one of them uses tapioca starch. Those two flours in and themselves have completely different properties. So that's why they will behave differently. The biggest thing, I think, to making gluten-free baking of any kind work is to understand that it's not gluten and it will never be gluten and it can't ever do exactly what gluten does. If you understand a little bit of the science about what gluten does and just how many things it does to your baked goods, doesn't matter what you're baking. It could be cookies, it could be a pastry, it could be sausage rolls. It doesn't really matter what you're doing. Oh, excuse me. Doesn't really matter what you're doing. It will never replicate what gluten does on its own. So that's why we use so many different aspects to try and get it to do that. So I think a big part about baking gluten-free is having the right mindset, knowing that it's not going to be just as easy as gluten used to be, but knowing that it's doable and it's achievable. Alrighty, we've got a couple of questions here, so I'm just going to jump into those. Can the leftovers be kneaded and used? Definitely, Peter, 100%. I always have little off-cut bits, and just like you used to with normal gluten pastry, fold them up into a ball, work them until they're nice and warm and soft, and then you can use them for other pieces. You can also wrap them, once they're in a bowl, wrap them into cling wrap and whack them in the fridge, but do not refreeze it. It won't like it. It'll freak out. Tara, do you ever use a damp tea towel over the pastry sheets on your counter when defrosting? Yes, I have done that, particularly if it is a very hot day, which out here, as you'll know, Swan Valley, it can be a very dry heat. So using a damp tea towel over the pastry sheets, 100% will work. Always just make sure it's clean. And I would make sure it's not dripping wet. You want to soak your tea towel and give it a good wring out and then pop it over top. Thank you, Julie. I'm sure she's probably gone now. Bye-bye. So if you guys are interested in learning more about gluten-free baking tips and tricks, if you haven't already got it, jump onto my newsletter list and download my 7 tips for nailing gluten-free baking. There are some really easy, simple little steps that you can do that will make baking gluten-free just that little bit easier. And if you are keen to learn more about the science of it and actually get really in-depth with your gluten-free baking. I am about to launch my Introduction to Gluten-Free Baking course. So if you are interested in learning more about that, feel free to drop a comment and I will shoot you the link to that so you can learn more. But I think that's it for now, guys. I think I covered all of my easy little tips, but that's it. Baking gluten-free doesn't have to be hard. Dealing with gluten-free puff pastry definitely doesn't have to be hard. And if you follow my 3 plus bonus extra tip, every time you do it, you are bound to never have any major problems. And honestly, I use the Coles brand all the time. I use the Simply Wize brand all the time. And they're both amazing products. When used well and fresh, they will do and can do miraculous things for you. So if there's no more questions, guys, I think that's it from me. Simply Wize, definitely. I was always a fan of Simply Wize, and I will say this. I know a lot of people have said it has changed in the last few years, and it has. I will tell you that. And this happens actually all the time. The gluten-free White Wings flour blend, for example, changed, I reckon, probably 12 months ago, and I actually don't like it anymore. Like, I almost won't use it. I used to use it on everything, and if you look at any of my recipes, it's normally my go-to brand, but I can't stand what it does now. They have changed the formulation, and because you don't know the percentages of which ingredients they use, in particular with flours, how much of each flour they use, you won't know what changes they've made, but it could be microscopic, and it completely changes the way you bake. So my go-to blend, if you're curious, is the Well and Good range of flours, including their pastry flour, is awesome. And I know a couple of people did ask before about pastry. Homemade pastry is actually really, really easy to do gluten-free. And I have a really simple short crust pastry flour recipe on the blog. Just jump on and have a search for it and give it a go. But thank you very much, guys. Thanks for tuning in. This is the beginning of the YouTube empire. Next Wednesday, a brand new recipe will be going up, and I'm sure you guys are going to love it. But thank you, and thanks, Peter. Thanks, guys. I'll see you later.